Well, welcome to our podcast once again, Stories from Here to Everywhere, where we explore stories about community based global learning from here to everywhere, connecting communities, classrooms, and cultures through the community based global learning collaborative. We're your hosts for today,
I'm Mac Benavides.
and I'm Dennis McCunney. Mac, how you doing today? How are
I'm
things in
doing
your
all
world?
right. It's
Good.
getting close to the end of the semester, so all the final wrap ups of everything, but overall, enjoying the opportunity to see students learning kind of culminate and they're starting to really reflect on what they've gained throughout the semester. What about you?
Great.
You just had to
Nice.
move.
Nice.
You're probably pretty
Just
sore.
had it. I'm a little sore. I've been painting a new house for the next month, and I'm taking a group of students to Jamaica next week, and just learned that we'll be painting there too. So,
All right, you got
lot,
some
lots of
practice up there.
yeah, yeah. So, having painting dreams, and it's just a part of my life now. But anyway, looking forward to that trip. It's much needed hurricane rebuilding, and looking forward to seeing friends there. So, that's going to be a good time. But yeah, we're excited today. We're thrilled that we're joined by our first guest officially, the collaborative's managing director, Mike Bishop. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks,
How you
y'all.
doing?
Be with you.
Yeah, glad you're here, Mike. Just as a way of intro, maybe you could share a little bit about yourself to let the our audience know who you are and what you're all about. What brings you here?
Thanks, Dennis. Thanks, Mac. I really appreciate you two holding this space. I have been the managing director, the only paid staff member of the collaborative for the past year and a half. So I'm surrounded by 50 volunteers, which is very nice. Everyone else volunteers their time with the collaborative, which is an amazing model. And I found my way to the collaborative after 25 years almost in higher ed. And even before that, a brief career in youth development. And so I led adventure-based counseling activities for court-committed youth in Missouri and Massachusetts. Some were live-in programs, and all really helped young boys really get back on track. That was the hope. And so that idea of experiential learning, critical reflection really started to emerge there for me. And then I made the transition into higher ed, first through a master's program and broke into higher ed, working at Harvard College for a couple of years. And then I'll say I found my dream job, one of my dream jobs at University of California, Berkeley. So I stepped onto the campus as an experiential educator, and I like to say I left the campus 10 years later as a social justice educator or aspiring social justice educator.
Nice.
And so much of that was my own personal journey while I was working at Berkeley, getting myself involved with solidarity movements, identifying more and more as an anti-racist community organizer. And so when the opportunity presented itself to move back to the East Coast, where I'm from, my roots are in New York State. I saw a job at Cornell as a way to serve my home region, to work with a lot of rural, especially rural white folks around the ideas of mass incarceration, anti-racism. And as you were saying, Dennis, about painting, I often brought some of the skills I was practicing in my personal work, my community work into higher ed. And so at Cornell, working with Engage Cornell, I became more and more a leadership educator and started playing with this idea of community engaged leadership. There's a lot of talk of community engaged learning, community engaged research. And so was really fortunate to find mentors in this region, as well as finding amazing mentors in Missouri and California as well. And so after 8 years at Cornell, left there for this job at the collaborative, and the collaborative's mission and values really speak to me. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about those principles. And so just really glad to be in this role where it's challenged me to think about how to call in community-based educators as well as university-based educators. I consider myself in some ways a community member who's infiltrated into higher ed from my roots in youth development. And so I think about that often in this role with the collaborative as far as creating equal level playing fields for all collaborative members to participate and enjoy all the resources that we have.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, Mike, you have a wealth of amazing experiences that you bring to the table, and we're all, I think, really lucky to benefit from your organizational and leadership abilities. So we're really grateful for that. And I think what we're hoping to do, and Mike, you're going to help us, like you said, shed some light on that today, to hopefully take the opportunity during this second episode to share a little bit more about some of the underlying commitments of the community-based global learning collaborative that you referenced, the things that really drive our work and that unite all of us, and more specifically highlight the seven practical components of this work, which is going to inform everything that we talk about in future podcast episodes. So that's how we'll be talking about things in this conversation today.
Yeah, I feel like one of the things that you brought to mind for me, Mike, as you were talking, is this community really is made up of a lot of boundary spanners, people who
Mhm.
are doing work in higher education spaces, but also in the community, people who identify as scholar practitioners and others who identify as practitioner scholars, and boundary spanning is really a huge part of what we do. So.
A lot of hyphenated self-identification, right? Like I'm an activist
Yeah.
scholar. Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely. I
Yep.
feel like I just start wearing like a tree hat on my or one of those hat trees on my head to keep all the different hats I wear. So based on the collaborative's work, the collaborative defines community-based global learning as a term that's developed by academics and researchers who are also practitioners, right? So and it's defined by a set of seven practical components. We're going to dive a little bit further into these, but I'm just going to list them real quick so that our audience is able to be familiar with these. So community-driven learning and or service, development of cultural humility, global citizenship, continuous and diverse forms of critically reflective practice, ongoing attention to power, privilege, and positionality through programming and coursework, deliberate and demonstrable learning, and safe, transparent, and well-managed programs. So,
Mhm.
Mike, we'd love to have you share a little bit more about these components and why they're important to the work that our community does. The collaborative is advancing, and all of the different volunteers and members that are part of this community are committed to these components.
Yeah, and I really think it's these components, these principles that give the network our shape. I'd like to think of us as a membership-driven network, and that's a challenge to think about what that means. I think these principles, along with how we try to live these principles, really give us an identity as a
Mhm.
collaborative. And so the idea of community driven, I think about my current work with indigenous led movements for sovereignty, and I was able to work with that a little bit in my dissertation at Cornell, in my PhD in global development, really thinking about how do we create these trusting relationships that can lead to this idea of community driven, not only learning and service, and also community driven impact and development. And so I think that feature of the work is really important because, on the one hand, I think about how our memberships as our community are driving what the collaborative becomes. Cultural humility, and in my role as an organizer, managing director, husband, the idea of being humble, especially with the unearned benefits that I have and that I've been raised with. And so it's allowed me to create trusting relationships, and that value of cultural humility is something we aim to measure in our global engagement survey. And it's something that I hope that I model in my interactions with our members of the collaborative. Global
One
citizenship. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna add, like, I feel like that cultural humility piece, and this is one of the great things about all of these components, and why I feel like the that practicality is at the forefront, because there's overlap across all of them, right? Like, even when we think
Mhm.
about
Mhm.
cultural humility, I think it's easy for us to think about like culture in terms of ethnic differences or geopolitical boundaries, different countries that we come from, but even just the culture between academia and community
Mhm.
organizations, right? That level of humility for us to be able to understand how do we interact with one another. That's uh, I think navigating different timelines and bureaucratic processes and all that. That's been one of the biggest learning curves for me as I've been continuing to develop partnerships with my colleagues in the locally led community organizations. So
Yeah.
that's I feel like there's a lot of really interesting overlap across these.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's one of those values, Mike, that you talk about as really foundational. And I think sometimes it's hard to convey that in other professional spaces, other professional associations, to make sure that that value is held kind of front and center. I think sometimes, especially within the world of higher ed, there's a bit of a top down, or we've got the knowledge, and we are privileged to have that knowledge too. I also think it's really practical, value too. I think about an experience I had with one of my students, and we were in Northern Ireland, and the student in particular had not had a lot of international travel experience or global learning experience, and we were talking about the troubles between the Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, and the student said, I'm a newly converted Catholic, and if the Protestants around here want to learn anything about the Holy Eucharist, I'm happy to share with them what it's all about. And so that was like a bless your heart kind of moment. I'm like, that's very sweet, and we kind of chuckled about it, right? But it came from a good place, but it was also like, let's sort of check ourselves a little bit and say like, oh, I think
Mm.
the issue is much more complicated and complex than just just one particular religious practice. So it comes up and shows itself in a variety of different ways, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I think that humility, it's not the dominant form of leadership either, right? When we look
Hmm.
around and we see how we define a leader today, and so I think these principles or values are all somewhat subversive or countercultural, and and even thinking about how masculinity is performed and what a humble man might look like these days. I think bringing in these other social identities and also as you talk about religion, I think it's really important, especially when it comes to the idea of global citizenship, and that's
Mhm.
through critical reflection and I like to think of whether the next horizon of critical reflective practice is a decolonizing reflective practice.
Mm.
In my own practice, it's helped me to see how global is right here in my backyard, and working with indigenous communities also starts to interrogate the question of citizenship and who is a citizen, who wants to be a citizen, and these are the questions that propel a lot of our work forward. Something else I heard you both talking about was how the humility piece, how all these principles show up in how we manage programs,
Hmm. Hmm.
and even the interplay between critical reflection and what safety is, right? And especially when I was working with the alternative breaks programs at UC Berkeley, it provided such a great opportunity to talk about the differences between safety and comfort, and to really help students reflect on those questions, to help them really think about their own upbringing and where they feel safe, where they don't feel safe. I think learning has a little bit of discomfort in it. And so trying to create a feeling of safety so people can take risks is something that I've tried to do as well throughout my career teaching and working with both in academia and organizing in my communities.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think too, that creating that space to think about safety and comfort is, I think, one of the hallmarks, Mike, thinking about your background too, of experiential learning pedagogy, and making sure there's space for critical reflection. And so maybe share a little bit more about how the collaborative promotes promotes that particular educational practice, right? We've got the interdependence toolkit. We've got all sorts of resources around that.
And we do have, as a part of the toolkit, I think a lot of it comes down to facilitation and how we create these spaces for students. And I think about my own practice of building community in classrooms, but also building communities from classroom to community. I think this is where we can learn a lot from community, and rather that notion which in some circles, right, that the highest level of this work looks like higher ed extending its hand with our
Mm,
knowledge and resources and research, thinking about how communities can really inform us, especially frontline communities, with how folks have stayed together, built trusting relationships. And a phrase that I said to my friend Janelle Beauvais recently, who's Mohawk, and we're writing a book together, was let's be safe with each other so we can be dangerous together. And so, and for me as the managing director, I think about within the collaborative spaces, how am I creating safety for our members, for our action team members, for our steering committee, all the people who volunteer their time and effort, so that folks feel a sense of safety, and we're modeling then with that safety, people are able to take risks,
Mm,
and with that, the risks and courage, we're able to see parts of ourselves and advance the work in ways maybe we never thought we could by being courageous in those spaces.
mhm, mhm,
It also makes me think when you were talking about, critically reflective practice and building these communities of safety and communities of practice within the classroom, but also within our programs, and then also within the community. One of the lessons that I've learned with community is to really expand or complicate my understanding of both partners. There's a lot of different people who are involved in community and in higher education, right? So it makes me think about a session that a couple of colleagues and I facilitated last year or the year before, I can't remember now, but we brought together people who work with our PR, people who help us work through risk assessment. We brought together students and faculty and staff as well, to really kind of talk about what are our priorities, what are our values, and how do we make sure that those are at the forefront of the work that we do. Because what we realized is it's one thing to have those conversations with other, program administrators or faculty that care about this work. But how do we also make sure, and not to say that others don't, but how do we also make sure that we're aligned with the people who are telling these stories and for
mhm,
the public? How do we make sure that even when we're adjusting the story slightly to meet different audiences, the underlying values are still there. The
mhm,
values don't change by the audience, but the way we tell the story might.
Mm.
So bringing together a lot of different people into that reflective practice, I think is something that the collaborative also helps us to consider what does that look like in practice.
mm. Nice.
Yeah, yeah, and one of the strengths of the collaborative is when people are cross-pollinating and sharing ideas, and we're learning from each other. To me, that sort of reciprocity that we're practicing within the collaborative is what CBGL looks like when we're working with our partners. And Mac, you reminded me when I was at UC Berkeley and I mentioned the alternative breaks program, we would hold an end of trip celebration, and we made sure to invite the folks who reserved our vehicles for us, the folks from risk management, and they would come to those sessions and they would listen to the students reflect and participate in those, and they would walk away with such great meaning behind their work as folks who are providing really important background support. And so they're able to see the fruits of their labor in student learning. And so the next time we worked with them, they were so excited to provide us with amazing service because they understood the impact they were having on students and communities.
Nice. Nice. Yeah. Well, I think that really speaks to our next practical component that we have on our list, this idea of paying attention to power, privilege, and positionality. So critical, so important, and kind of gets to your point, Mac, about just how we share these stories, right? And what voices are shared. It also speaks, I think, to our makeup in the collaborative too, the types of members that we have, and regardless of your institutional type or your title or your formal educational background, um, all of it is ideally an egalitarian kind of approach, and making sure that yeah, resources and power or play out differently depending on the spaces we inhabit. So trying to make sure we're particularly attentive to that reality. Any thoughts to share on that one, Mike?
I mean, try to stay attuned to power for sure. And like with conflict, I try to see power as neutral. I think a lot of folks try to hold power at arm's length. I think it's important to embrace the power we have. And I mentioned this writing project I'm engaged with my friend Janelle, and one of our really deep dive topics is where does our power come from? And
Mm,
there are the social structures that lend us power for sure. And I think there are deeper forms of power. And this is where, as I'm also not only managing director of the collaborative, but doing some adjunct teaching on the side, I happen to be teaching a course on the sociology of race, power, and privilege. And so creating space for students to really think about that. And it struck me, we can't really think about privilege without thinking about oppression. I mean, they're two sides of the same coin. So I think part of this is also being honest where power has gone wrong in the past and staying attuned to that, not only historically, but so that we don't repeat some of the same mistakes. And so I think then in my space in the collaborative, thinking about my role to create level playing fields where all people can experience their power. And I like to say where all people can bring all of themselves, whether they want to
mm,
share all of themselves or not, but we've created space for people to empower themselves, which I think is very different from empowering people. So anyway, that's my mindset of how can we create this space so that people can bring all of themselves and feel their own power in doing that and commit as much as they want to the collaborative, right? That we have this porous way that folks can indicate their alignment with these values through our Fair Trade Learning Pledge or work their way toward a steering committee over 2 or 3 years. And so this way for folks to work with their own power. And I think seeing how other people in the collaborative do that is also one of those ways that we cross-pollinate and give people a sense of safety that we're here together, we're in this together, we're all trying to practice these same principles.
I think that's where a lot
excellent.
of that really deliberate and demonstrable learning comes from as well, is the practical opportunity to leverage our privilege to be able uh, to take this work that we're doing and actually and to make meaning of it. To think about how does this reflect broader systems that we're a part of? How will this how might this be an example that I can use in my future career to be able to make change happen where it's needed? Or to contribute when I don't have a specific title or role, but that doesn't mean that I am powerless. And so
Mm,
a lot of the learning that I found in these types of in this type of work comes from that opportunity uh, to really connect with people on the ground and to be part of a bigger effort.
Yeah, yeah, I agree for sure. And I think as I became more and more took on this identity of a leadership educator, I do think leaders are lifelong learners, right? And the way to lifelong learning is through critical reflection. And so the learning piece for me is like, oh, that's something I also have to model. And even in my gray years now, as I'm approaching my sixth decade, right? That it's what I learn after I think I know it all that's important. And so keeping myself open for learning is really important, and creating that sort of space and spirit within the collaborative is also important for us as well.
yeah, yeah. Our last on our list is of these seven components is making sure that we are upholding the value of safety, transparency, and well-managed programs, right? Maybe sound like a given, but I think it's particularly important, especially when we are bringing cultures together, so to speak, people from different backgrounds, different parts of the world, and also recognizing that. Um, the stakes are too high when we are doing community-based work. If our programs are not well planned and really thoughtful, that we could sometimes do more harm than good, right? We could unintentionally reinforce stereotypes. We could potentially turn students off from global experiences. So I think this is a really, really important one, right?
Completely. And I think that, again, that's safety and interrogating those feelings of safety. And for us, there's a messiness in this work. And so I do
Mhm.
believe, like, yes, I need to go in with a plan and be intentional. And also, as a part of that intention, knowing I'm going to have to flex at some point because something will go sideways, having experienced that myself. And so, again, modeling that for students. I think the work we're doing while they're university students can help them consider how they can be lifelong change agents or working in communities. And so as we respond to changing dynamics with our partners or on short-term trips or long-term trips, I think it's important for students to see us working with those dynamics. And I would say, yes, well-managed programs and well-led programs, right? That there's the management piece and then there's also the leadership piece. And both are important. And wherever possible, because it's in my roots, having students co-lead or co-manage, I've seen makes it all the more impactful. And so preparing students to lead their peers in safe, well-managed trips, even if they're for academic credit or not, I think is a really important feature of this work at its root that seems to be getting watered down more and more as times progress here. And so I still try to hold fast to that idea of students as colleagues in the co-management of programs.
Yeah.
I also think
Nice.
from that reciprocity standpoint, thinking about what does safety, transparency, and strong management of the program look like from the partner's perspective?
Mm.
How do we
Hmm.
make sure that we're managing risks and possible harm within the community for our partners, and making sure that that story or where the focus on the work that we're doing is telling both sides of that story, or all
Mm.
Yeah.
sides of that story.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
there's definitely opportunities for us to make sure that we're, and I think that's what the collaborative does. It make sure that we're constantly thinking about the more holistic partnership rather than just thinking about our side of things or their side of things, recognizing that there's a lot more than just these two pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mike, for joining us today. That's it for our episode. For our audience, make sure to click subscribe to keep up to date on all things community-based global learning. And we also invite you to check out the Collaborative's website. That's cbglcollab.org. So cbglcollab.org to access resources and toolkits, read the latest blogs, and learn more about fair trade learning. From the website, you can also join the Collaborative's mailing list to receive news and updates. And you can stay up to date and stay connected by following the Collaborative on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Slack. And you can find the links for those in the description below. If you have something you want to share on our podcast or the CBGL blog, you can also nominate yourself or others to share about work and experiences that are empirically grounded, inform practice, and demonstrate application of the principles we share. As always, from here to everywhere, thanks for tuning in.